talk about the work that we do in my lab, which is related to implementing new technologies to assist bees in the crop environment. And that's to address different things like food quality issues as well as things like pesticide sprays. So what most people don't know is that we have 3 managed bee species in Canada. You guys probably do because you work in crops. But so the honeybee, most people are familiar with that. We do a lot of work with leafcutter bees, but we also work with bumblebees, the 3rd species. And so each of these, of course, is in specific crops. So honeybees are in a much broader range of crops than leafcutter bees, at least for now. And bumblebees were traditionally used in greenhouses and are now branching out into fruit crops as pollinators. So to begin with, I think, let me just do introductions. This is Travis. He works in the lab this summer, and he will be talking about the bumblebees. This is Nora Chomistek, and she will be talking about the honeybees, and I'll do the leafcutter bees. So we'll just tally-ho because we only have 35 minutes.
Hi everybody. The honeybee is probably the most well-known of the 3 managed bee species because everybody knows them, I would say, because you eat honey. Who doesn't like honey? A typical beehive is how they're managed. So you would be putting this out into your fields. You'd have a bottom board, a main hive with a lid, and inside the hive you have these frames, like so. And as you can see, in the hive they would be covered on both sides with honeybees. Now, a typical hive will have 1 queen, and she kind of runs the hive based on pheromone signals that she puts out. And there are drones, which are the male bees, and they're only around in the summer. The bees actually kick them out in the winter time because they're not useful to them at all. Their sole purpose in life is reproduction. They can't even feed themselves. They do nothing. They contribute nothing other than their reproductive parts. And so in the winter time, it's too much work to feed them, so they just pick them right out of the hive. The worker bees are the most important part of the hive next to the queen. There's up to 50,000 worker bees in a hive, and worker bees are actually quite neat. They have different jobs based on the age that they are. So the youngest bees, when they first emerge out of their little cell, their first job is to clean out the cell that they emerged out from. So first job is cleaners. And then they turn into nurse bees, so that means they help rear larvae and pupae. Then they get a little bit older, they start building honeycomb, maybe storing honey, and the oldest bees are foragers. So those are the ones that leave the hive, go out and forage for nectar and pollen. There's some other kind of neat jobs in between, like the undertaker bee. Its job is to take dead bees, fly them far away from the hive and drop their dead bodies off. Or there is guard bees, so they don't let strangers enter the hive. There's bees that spend time cooling the hive when it's warm in the summertime.
How do they do that? How do they cool it?
Flap their wings. They usually stand at the entrance right down here, and they kind of create an airflow to kind of go through the hive, cooling it down. So the inside of the hive actually stays at quite a constant temperature both in the summer and the winter. In the winter time, they form a ball of bees, and based on the temperature, it's a tighter ball or a looser ball, and it's kind of like penguins. Just recently watched a show about penguins and how they stay warm, and bees do the same thing. So the ones from the outside just constantly kind of turn onto the inside, so no one ever gets cold, but everybody takes their turn being on the outside. So another interesting thing about honeybees is that there are summer bees and winter bees. In the summertime, the queen produces lots of brood, and they have lots of turnover of bees, just because a lot of the foragers, they can get caught in weather and not come back. They can get picked off by birds or other predators. So you're constantly, plus you need a lot of bees to put down enough stores for the winter. But in the winter time, it's 1 set of bees. So the female lays its winter bees in the fall, so let's say September, October, November, depending on the weather. And those bees overwinter all the way to March, April, until the weather warms up. So those are, what we've been finding are really, really important, the winter bees. And we've also been finding that the winter bees are a lot more susceptible to pesticides than the summer bees. So if you are spraying your fields, it's important to keep in mind So the winter bees, so that's like March, April, May. Not sure how much you're really spraying at that time, but they don't like it. They are, no matter what we gave them in the lab, they died. They are super, super sensitive to pesticides, the winter bees.
So the one in April, May, you still call them winter bees, even though they're the new brood?
They're not
the new brood is.
So it would be, what she
summer
means
bees.
is when they're winter bees and they have not yet made the first brood, those are the ones that you will 100% kill them no matter what concentration you put out there. Just those ones.
Any chemical,
We
or
weren't
only
able-
insecticides?
Okay, so far we've only looked at the chemicals that are applied in canola and alfalfa, and so far it's holding pretty true that everything but herbicides does it.
Okay, so fungicides too.
Fungicides too. Yeah. Oh, do you want to talk about the food?
Nope. So one of the things our lab has been working with is trying to give them a different diet than they're currently receiving. So for example, in the fall or in the summer, we take their honey away, right? That's one of the things we collect from honeybees. But the reason they put down that honey is so that they can make it through the winter. So what farmers do currently is they provide them with sugar water that they convert into honey and store through the winter. So we are looking at adding maybe some protein sources in there to try to have them a healthier diet for the winter time when the bees are the weakest. And we're also trying to use different food additives to maybe give them a different nutritive value that maybe benefit them over the winter so that they can come out stronger in the spring.
And the final thing is that we're using these, they're really animal-based technologies, livestock-based technologies for these bees. And we've actually been able to show in the lab at this point, we're still determining if it happens in the field, but we can actually protect the bees from pesticide spray applications by having this material present in the bee's gut at the time the spray happens. So there's a whole lot of technical things that have to go around that in order to make it work for the grower of the crop and the bees, but we're working on that now for the honeybees.
So what is that chemical? Or
Sorry?
what is the product?
So the product we're using is a prebiotic, and it's because in livestock it's used to bind food toxins that the cattle ingest, and it can make them very, very sick and cause production crashes. So prebiotics are fed through almost like I always describe it like a mop. They kind of go in and clean up the chemicals that might be in the food matter that the animals are ingesting, and then they don't become sick because the systems that those things affect are not actually turned on or off or whatever it is that they
So
happen
it's
to do.
bacterial?
No,
Not to be
it's
confused
not.
with the probiotic.
No, that's a probiotic. Most people have heard about probiotics. Those are living organisms. Prebiotics can be made from many, many different kinds of things, but they're non-living. And they're what's called non-digestible oligosaccharides. So there's different compositions. So if you try one and it fails, don't give up. Go to the next one, because one of them will work. I can guarantee you, if you have cattle and you have any type of gastrointestinal or peripheral tissue disorder, you can use these things to manage it. I've done a fair amount of work in cattle. So this is transferring it to bees. Okay. So that's it for the honeybees. So for leafcutter bees, you can see we've set up a cage of these guys. How many of you know leafcutter bees? Cool. One of my favorite bees, if I could say so. It is my favorite bee.
Not my wife's.
Oh, really? I love them. So in here, if you want to come and look later, there's some painted ones. We use paint on these bees so that we can actually track them to find out where they're going in the fields, how far they're going, whether they come back. And that really has a lot to do with we think we don't really understand how to monitor these things in the field, to understand if we do something, whether or not it has an impact or not. So we're working out that technical, I would call it a technical glitch right now, in order to better understand what these things are doing in the crop. So one of the experiments that we've been running the last 3 years is developing a food for leafcutter bees, because they're currently not fed or weren't fed before we started the work. And we did this because, shockingly to all of us in the lab, the growers of leafcutter bees did not think that these bees needed to be fed. at all, that they would be fine during the whole rearing process. And if you're familiar with leafcutter bee rearing, you know that the bees are reared at very high temperatures so that they time the emergence of these adults to the bloom in the field. So the problem is you cannot starve a bee and have it live. So in the lab we had to first prove it to the growers. So we did that first and showed that males die within 3 days, females die within one? No, females were 3, males were less, weren't they?
Males are 1 to 3, females probably
Yeah,
5.
3 to 5. Females are a little longer just because they have fat body reserves for reproduction. So at any rate, so we started developing this food, and so the tricky bit is how do we implement? So we spent a lot of time with growers and figured out that tray flip time would be the best time to put this food in. And some people don't flip trays, but they do look at their trays at day 15. So that's when we put these food dishes in. The first year went great. We did a preliminary. We liked what we saw. The growers liked what they saw. So we only did a few trays, like 3 rows. We didn't do big time, okay? But last year we did 6 quarter sections of alfalfa. This year we've got 12 quarter sections of alfalfa, 2 different locations in Alberta. And, well, we actually have about 9 officially in Alberta. 2 in Saskatchewan, 3 in Saskatchewan.
2 in Manitoba, 2 in Saskatchewan, and
8 or 9?
6 in Alberta.
Oh, 6. Okay, and so the 2 ones that we're working on, they're the main ones that we're doing our field work on are in Lomond and Enchant area. And so we put this food in at day 15 and then we follow them, the bees, all the way through the summer, and we're evaluating returns. If the food is benefiting the bees, we will see a higher cocoon return. That's what we got last year. We didn't see a change in the sex ratio of the bees as a result of feeding them. So that meant to us we still have a problem with the quality of the diet. So this past winter, Nora spent most of it figuring out what was wrong with this food. What didn't we have in there that the bees needed? And it turns out we need vitamins. And so we were doing lots of things with the diet to modify it, but the vitamins really were the thing that made the difference. And so we developed this new diet, again, going from 2 cups, 2 types of diet going in at day 15 down to this single cup that you'll see here on your left. And so that's gone out this year, and so far the diet has passed. So that means grower approved and that means research approved, both. So easy to use, easy to put into the system. And so what we're hoping this year is not only will we get a higher cocoon return with the food, but we'll also change the sex ratio. Okay, so that's one aspect of what we're doing with the leafcutter bees. The second thing that we're doing, and if you want to see all of our mistakes, they're here. All the different diets we came up with along the way. And if you want to see, this is the beast that we're also looking at trying to do something about. This is called Terra Malice. It's a parasite that adversely affects the bees in storage. And that's because at the end of the field season, for those that don't know, this thing is full of leafcutter bee cocoons, which are really just their young, and they're stored over winter. And during that storage process, these guys just wreak havoc. We only know that because of our own experience with it under the same storage conditions that are used by growers. And so what we've been doing is saying, okay, right now the only option for growers is dichlorvos, which is Vapona, to control this beast. I personally don't like this material. That's a personal preference because of the nature of it, and that growers go in and out of these sheds when the degassing is going on with the Vapona strips. So we started looking at some really crazy things. So if you look over here, there's a whole bunch of different herbs and spices that we've started to treat cocoons with to see if we could control Terra Malice. And so we went with some various types, but at the end of the day, it's the warm spices that really work to control Terra Malice. Now, we have our favorites, but this again is from lab-based experiments. So this year we're going to do it in the lab. We have large-scale trials going with cocoons, with these materials mixed, to find the one that will give us hopefully the same level of control that dichlorvos does. But if it goes like our first experiments, we think that 2 of these materials will give us 100% knockout. We aren't really looking for 100%, but it's close to that. So as a control alternative, this is cost effective. It's easy for growers to buy. They can even go out to their corner store and get it. And it can easily be metered in when the cocoons are punched out. So it's another type of project that we're doing, again, in conjunction with the growers, just to find out if there's a different way that we could control that big one aspect of their management for the storing of winter cocoons. So that's...
What kind of herbs do you use?
So we started with about 13 different ones, and we've kept adding as we learn. So, you know, we started basil, oregano, the typical ones, right? Because everybody knows oregano oil is used widespread in livestock to control, you know, various types of gastrointestinal issues. So we just went from that. There's a lot of data in the literature about these things. We just started from the beginning and said, what can we do? Let's see if it works at all. I mean, if you do a quick and dirty, I call it, you're just dumping the stuff in, you're just saying, okay, what happens? Then you have to fine tune it, because if it's not cost effective, it isn't going to go anyway. So the whole idea was to find something that everyone, no matter how remote where they were living, they would be able to find one of these materials. If we have, say, 4 that we come up with, and a low enough percentage of the material that it will function in storage, then that's fantastic for the grower. The second thing that is a big issue for cocoons in storage is fungal growth. So what we've also looked at with these materials is which ones inhibit fungal growth. So that's the chalk brood that affects the cocoons in storage. So all of those things we're looking at, but these are the 2 main projects for this year in the field.
So I guess which spice seems to be working? Like you said, it was a warmer spice. So is that like a hot, like a pepper, or is that?
No.
Well, that's what I was trying to.
No. Warm spices are things like cloves, cinnamon,
Okay,
that kind of stuff, right? So turmeric, cumin, the warm spices. So if, like, this will be posted at some point on the Alfalfa Seed Commission's website once we get back a big enough return. But yeah, it's warm spices. Warm spices for cooking. Anybody a cook in there? Most women know what warm spices are because they make Christmas cookies with them. So, so anyway, that's where the idea came from. It was Brad started the work. He is actually the research manager at the Alfalfa Seed Commission, and we took it from his first preliminary experiments, and we've expanded and done the documentation of it, really, to ensure that it actually functions the way it looked like it was functioning. So, and I think, oh yeah, I think that's about all we need to say, I think. And okay, so Travis is going to talk about this little buggy. You might want to pick it up and bring it around.
Yeah, you guys can come up and take a look, or you can pass this around.
I don't think you should pass it around, because some people might be afraid of bumblebees.
So you guys can just come. No,
Yeah,
you can take it out.
you can. Yeah, yeah. You can see a big queen in there if you look carefully.
So bumblebees are not used as much in agriculture as much as the leafcutter bees and honeybees, although it is still used in orchids and in fields, fruit fields. However, they are very important pollinators for for flowers in the wild. Bumblebees in nature, they forage for food, they mate, and they hibernate. So it is very important that nectar and pollen, they have a wide variety of flowers to collect nectar and pollen from. And these types of bees are a little more hardy than the honeybees, and
So the big thing about bumblebees is that they're a very useful pollinator for greenhouses, and really they've started to branch out into other crops much the same way as I think it's going to go for the leafcutter bee as soon as they can document whether the benefit of using a leafcutter bee is equivalent to a honeybee. And I think it's just early days for these two bee species, but I think it's important to know that in Canada we do use all three of these species to ensure our pollination happens. In the old days, of course, we relied on wild bees, but we can't do that anymore. We're at such a scale for production. We need these managed bees to get the job done. The biggest thing you can do as growers is think about when you're spraying. Don't worry so much about what you're spraying as when you're spraying. So things like the honeybee, they are not active in the morning before 10. Generally speaking, if you look at the hives, you won't see much forager activity until it hits about 20. Then they start out and then they'll be going full tilt, right? But leafcutter bees, these guys, they won't be moving before noon. 24 degrees they need before they actually start taking flight. And so you can go out there, you have a kind of a bigger window. And at the end of the day, similarly, these guys go down earlier than the honeybees. And bumblebees, because they have the nest box, they have a slight, you won't run into them probably, but they have a different time frame as well. So you can actually time your sprays to protect the bees. And the growers that I work with, they're already doing that. They do a fantastic job. They're really watching, and they've done those checks. How late in the day should I go to apply my spray to protect my bees? And I think it actually is quite effective. It's just that we need to, we're working on that alternative feed additive being applied to the shelters or as a food source for the bees to 100% protect them from the spray applications.
So if you have to spray an insecticide
Yep.
for canola,
Which you do. Yeah, which you do.
But before 10 o'clock in the morning, you're generally going to be safe for the bee population. Yeah, it actually, I think so. Just from my own experience so far out in the fields I'm in, plus being around our own honeybee colonies. I think you have to be careful, you have to watch that. You can easily tell because you'll see them flying, or if you're in a leafcutter field, you'll hear them. I mean, they're just loud, there's so many of them. But in our world, that's what I think is these guys, because they know, I don't know if you've noticed this, but 3 days after a spray happens in my leafcutter bee fields, there's no bees. They just are silent. And then they come back. And so we've been looking at that. What actually is happening in that 3-day period where suddenly the bees are gone? Do they recover? Does it change their behavior? What does it do to the bees? And I'm not saying that the insecticides won't harm the bees. What I'm saying is we can learn how to apply them, and maybe we can find these technologies like the feed additive, and we can actually improve what happens with the bees in the field, so that we can prevent much of the damage that is done. If we get a 10% loss, it's not such a big thing, right? If you get a 50% loss, most growers are going to be pretty upset because that means a difference in yield. Yeah. So come on up if you want. We have even for you to take home if you'd like. You can take your leaf cutters and release them into your yard. I do it every year in mine. They don't survive.
Thank you. I don't need any more.
Yeah, I know. You probably have more than enough this year.
Yeah, our rose bushes are always gone.
Yeah, always. They love rose bushes. But they're actually the trickiest bee to feed. Like finding a food that these things would eat was almost impossible. Almost impossible. They are so tricky. They wouldn't touch honeybee food. They don't like it, don't give it to them.
So I mean, the assumption probably was from the people that multiply or
grow them.
Yeah. That they act kind of like bees,
Yeah.
like honeybees, take their own food.
Yeah.
But what they actually bring home is just the leaves to ferment, right? To make the heat for the larva and to feed on later on, right?
No. They actually, we spent a lot of time pulling the guts of these bees to get rid of all of that old myth.
Yeah.
The bees do take pollen, they do take nectar, and the females do make a nectar pollen plug. It's almost like a thick viscous food, and then they dump onto it a puddle of nectar at the very end, and they put an egg there.
And that's how, then they encompass that in a little wrapping of leaves, and that's how they're packaged up. So for example, the biggest thing we found out last summer is that when you spray, the females get confused. We don't know quite know why, but they get confused. So they don't construct a proper cell. They leave out the food, and actually they forget about the egg too. They make a shell, but they don't actually deposit anything. So, and it's about 1 or 2 cells per chamber row. If you know these things, each of these is a row. After a spray, you'll get 1 or 2 chambers that are kind of partially built, and then they'll come back and they'll make normal ones. So that's the good news, is that they do seem to be able to recover. We just don't know until this summer. We have to go out and do a lot more looking around the fields, because last summer we tried to find them and couldn't. Where do the bees go? I have no idea. So we have to find out what's happening. If they're just going, you know, these guys are small, so it's possible they're just on the ground and we can't see them wherever it is they're going, or maybe they fly into the hedgerows, but we didn't find them in the fields, which is the critical thing. So this is the big one this year. But come and look at, if you would like to see the different diets. This one you'll love. It's like fudge. The bees actually really liked this, but it didn't perform well in the incubators and going out to the field to make sure that the bees have food for the entire emergence time.
Which bees?
Leafcutter bees.
Okay.
Leafcutter bees. This food did not perform well. It performs well for honeybees. They love it. And the green color here, this is our prebiotic food. So it changes the color of it just so that we can clearly tell when the bees have consumed it, because then they poop it out their backside and we can see green frass around the colonies. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's everything. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Typical life cycle of a bee. So like say the honeybees.
Yeah. So the honeybee. Okay. Let's start with the leafcutter bees. The leafcutter bee will lay its egg, and the egg will develop to a 5th instar larvae by the end of the summer. If you're unlucky and you get a lot of degree days, they can actually emerge in Canada. We can get what they call that the summer emergence, so you get a 2nd generation in the field. It's not a huge percentage, even last summer when it was stinking hot. But what we did notice last year in our fields was that if a field was sparse, then you'd get a lot of 2nd generation, because the heat degrees in that field must be a lot higher than the one that's dense. So that happens. This one, they live all, this is 1 generation. These bees are released, they live all summer, and then they die in the field. That's it. They make 1 set of cocoons. We might get a very small amount of a 2nd generation, but normally not. These guys, the honeybees, basically you're looking at every 21 days we have a new batch of bees coming out of our colonies. So we want to do our assessments for these guys. We go out and look at impacts of treatments every 21 days. And that's because we want to see what happens every time a set of brood comes through. And then for us, our big focus is the winter bees, because we want to try to find a way to protect them, so that when they come out in spring, and you guys got to be out there doing your spring maintenance of your fields, you're going to be doing your herbiciding, you're going to be doing whatever, we want to find a way to put that protective material, that prebiotic I told you about, into their spring food early enough that we know they'll be protected. And we do know it actually changes the ability of the bee to be affected, because it changes the structure of the tissues inside the bee. And that's really important. So what a winter bee is like, if you can imagine, have you heard of leaky gut syndrome? A winter bee is sort of like that. They have a very leaky gut. It almost doesn't look normal. There's not a lot of structure to it. And then when they get to spring and they have that first meal, the good nectar meal, the good pollen meal in spring, that gut changes its structure, and then they're protected. They are not nearly as susceptible to the chemical pesticides. So that's what our objective is to find out how early do we have to have this thing in here in order to protect the bees no matter what you put out there, and that would be great, because then again it's an easy solution. You get in there, you get it into their spring food in March, say, rather than April, to ensure that they're good. So so this is about 21. Bumblebees, so what happens with bumblebees, these have multiple generations, so every 21 days, say. These guys, same thing as the honeybees, it's a colony, smaller, only about 150 individuals in here. These can get up to 80,000 individuals. But these ones, it's a little different. These overwinter with workers. Bumblebees don't. So the queen is what overwinters for the following year. In most cases, it's the queen. So none of the workers do. So if anything knocks out the queen in spring, it's over. So that's why you might see a bumblebee drop in populations faster than you might see a honeybee populations affected. And
how can you manage that?
these things, so it depends. So I think it's the same way. It's implementation of a technology to protect them, like this. Is it easy? No, it takes us thinking about it in a totally different way. When we first thought about taking the livestock technology and applying it to the bees, the biggest challenge is how do we do that in a way that it integrates with the current system? How do we make it easy? It's not that we can't find things that will protect the bees, it's how do we do it so that it can actually be implemented easily and taken up by the industry easily. And so that's what we try to do. That's our goal. So it hasn't been, we're describing this simple process, but it's actually been extremely challenging, particularly the leafcutter bee. And on top of that, we have to run all the tox studies with these bees to make sure that what we're seeing in the field makes sense relative to toxicity studies in the lab. So we have to confirm, because no one's going to believe us based on, oh, we think they did better. We have to actually prove it in the lab. So yeah, so we have that data now for the neonicotinoids. We know that the prebiotic protects the bees from all the neonicotinoids. It's just now we have to figure out, okay, do we put that in as a sleeve in March or April? When do we put it in? Would growers be willing to put it in at that time? How much does it cost? All of those things have to factor into the solution.
If you guys can all join me in thanking Danica and her team.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the relief coverage.
1,000 questions.